you ever noticed that contemporary novels feel very soulless? It's like they're missing something. They're not memorable, there's no message, and they leave you feeling kind of empty. I mean, just take a look at some of these covers. Don't judge a book by its cover, but the cultural critic Ted Gioia points out that these covers are extra soulless. Gioia writes that every cover looks like a circus clown's makeup kit, and he's not wrong. It's almost as if contemporary novels want to suck out your soul. After all, every single novel being published today looks and sounds the exact same, and it's about the exact same topic. Gioia attributes this phenomenon to the consolidation of small publishing houses into one giant publishing conglomerate, and he's not wrong. I'm old enough to remember when Penguin and Random House were two separate entities. It's clear today that these large publishing houses are profit-driven, which stifles originality. Large publishing houses are going to be very risk-averse, which doesn't allow much room for creativity. According to these publishing houses, it's harder to predict sales trends if you launch something completely new. This is all true, and generally I agree with Gioia's critique, but there is something else going on. Contemporary novels aren't just soulless because the publishing industry is profit-driven. If that were the case, then the publishing industry would be making money from these books. But the problem is that they don't. That suggests to us that there's another missing piece of the puzzle. Let's get into it. My name's Lisa, and you're watching Pens and Poison. So if publishing houses only publish books that they thought would make them money, then presumably they would be making money. But Gioia himself admits in his article that the publishing industry is actually losing a lot of money. They're not selling anywhere near the target of hundreds and thousands of copies. In fact, according to this article from 2022, half of all traditionally published titles sell fewer than 12 copies. You heard that correctly. Not 12,000, 12. Now listen, I don't know if this number is accurate. This is just based on one person's investigation into the data that's coming out from Penguin Random House, but I would venture to guess that the number is a lot smaller than most people think. I mean, think about all these titles that I just flashed on the screen. You have never heard of any of them, and for good reason, because no one is reading these books outside of tiny MFA circles. It's like the publishing industry is just one giant exclusive group chat only for MFA grads. MFA grads are all reading the same set of novels and producing novels that sound exactly like the same set of novels that they're reading, and then the cycle continues and all novels start to sound exactly the same. And of course, no one is reading these books. And it's this very risk aversion to innovation that is losing the publishing industry so much money. I'm a business owner, so I know a thing or two about sales. When I'm not doing Pens and Poison, I run a college counseling company on the side for some extra cash. And when I first launched my business, we marketed a broad variety of services: career coaching, resume editing, tutoring, writing coaching, college counseling. And after several months of operation, we found that out of these offerings, only a couple of them were making money, so we pivoted and we tried something new. And we continued to try new things until we found out what worked for us. Any sane business owner will tell you that if something isn't selling, the solution is not to double down on that thing that isn't selling. It is to try something completely new, and that does involve risk-taking, whether you like it or not. You are never going to find the new thing that works until you try all of the possibilities. The very secret to entrepreneurial success is innovation. This is not rocket science. Anyone who has taken a Business 101 class can tell you that innovation is at the center of all progress. And the reason that innovation works so well is that human beings are attracted to this idea of being special. They are attracted to finding new things, not reading the same thing over and over and over again. And if the goal is to make money, which it is for the publishing industry, then risk-taking is the number one thing that should be happening within the publishing industry. So I fundamentally reject this premise that publishing is soulless and evil because of the profit-making machine. I think actually if the publishing industry focused more on making money, they would actually inadvertently then start to produce literature that people actually want to read, because in a functional capitalist society, the people at the end of the day guide what sells. So if the publishing industry cared about making money, they would number one, take risks, number two, sign talent over tropes, number three, analyze gaps in the market, and number four, constantly try new things. Only way to create innovation is to make something that no one has ever done before. But instead, the publishing industry has latched onto the exact opposite formula. The publishing industry runs on trends, which is why you always hear authors talking about tropes, and it refuses to take risks. The reason that so many contemporary novels feel so soulless is because they have lost touch with the very engine that drives creativity and drives innovation: the people. In other words, publishers no longer publish books that people want to read. They publish books that other MFA grads want to read. And as a result, these books never exit MFA circles. And the fact is that few MFA students and publishing professionals are aren't even familiar with novels that don't follow the MFA house style or aren't written in a certain very specific way. Here's a great example of this, of something I went through very recently when I queried my latest novel, Blue Snow. So my novel channels a lot of great literary works because I fundamentally believe that literature is a centuries-old dialogue between the past and present. So my novel echoes The Catcher in the Rye, Pale Fire, and The Notes from the Underground. These are three books that are very exposition heavy. Now, if you've read any of these books, you'll know that nothing really happens in any of these books. Not on the surface, at least. The beauty of these three novels is they all run on psychological depth and writing style. This is what publishing professionals like to call voice, but they actually don't care about unique voices if it's not a particular MFA voice. And Salinger, Nabokov, and Dostoyevsky intentionally write in a style that is more interior, that is more psychological, that is less plot-driven, because that allows us to see the inner psychology of these three characters, and that is part of the reason that we still read these novels today. These novels are not about what happens to these characters, they are about understanding the inner psychological state of these three characters that all go crazy in their own ways. So in my first round of agent queries, I sent out a novel that's deliberately structured in the vein of Catcher in the Rye. If you're a serious literary reader, you should immediately catch the Catcher parallel, and that should immediately tell you something about the novel's themes. And like Holden, my protagonist doesn't initially want to say what is bothering her because she has a lot of repressed feelings that mirror some of her issues. So you don't really understand exactly what the novel's about until much later. It's deliberately withheld to give you a sense of this character's psychology. The same thing can be said of The Underground Man, where the first 80 pages or so are these random tangents and you're wondering, what does this have to do with anything? And then you realize how that connects to some of his life experiences later down the road in the second half of the book. And the cool thing about Notes from the Underground is that we don't need to be hit over the head with all the themes. By the time we're done reading through all of his seemingly arbitrary musings, we know exactly what the novel is about and we know exactly why he has become a recluse. Those random tangents actually don't end up being so random. So in the original version of my novel, I had these very deliberate digressions. And those digressions were at the heart of the book's literary and psychological architecture. The effect is that by the time you're thrust into the main story, you look back on those first several chapters and you feel a little bit unsettled because you already know parts of the character's psychology and you know that something is a little bit off by the time it gets to the actual plot story. This is the same way that Kim Boat's introduction to John Shade's poems functions in Pale Fire. You read that introduction to Pale Fire and you feel like something is off, and then you start reading these sorts of arbitrary notes to Pale Fire and you continue to feel like something is off until you figure out what's going on. For lack of a better term, this sort of writing is very cool, but not for literary agents. Within a week of sending out my sample chapters, I started to get complaints about how my narrator was too rambly and too digressive and how I should basically cut out these ramblings or make them into scenes. My conflict wasn't clear enough from the first 5 pages, and my sentences were too long. And I had written these long sentences deliberately because they show the inner turmoil that this character is facing. When your brain is overwhelmed with thoughts, you're not thinking in 3-word sentences. You are thinking in these long, rambly, digressive sentences that show that something is falling apart inside of your mind. And that's the key psychological effect in my novel, and that's why I think it's actually pretty cool. But for literary agents, there wasn't enough action in the first 5 freaking pages, and there wasn't enough narrative propulsion. So they told me to redo my intro chapters, and so I sat down, I looked at all these notes from literary agents, and I wrote the chapters in exactly the way that these agents wanted. I swapped out internal monologues for scenes, and I started clipping my sentences. I cut all the psychological asides, and before you know it, I had a screenplay in novel form. My chapters had less voice, less personality, and no soul. Certainly less originality, but within days of sending out this new version, I got 7 manuscript requests from literary agents. But the problem is, I didn't want to work with these literary agents anymore because what I had submitted was not my writing and it was no longer my novel. So I went back, started sending out the original version, and crickets. Even though the original version of my novel is so much better, so much deeper. The new version just read like a soulless screenplay. So this is what is happening today in the publishing industry and why every single book sounds the same. Literary agents don't want digressions. They don't want psychological interiority. They don't want long sentences. They don't want anything that causes the reader to think for more than 2 milliseconds. And as a result, you see an entire generation of novels with minimalist sentences and soulless aesthetics. And the other problem is that because publishing professionals only read contemporary novels, they don't even register that there's a whole different way of writing that has existed for thousands and thousands of years that is not this one watered down MFA aesthetic. So their perception is that any type of writing that doesn't adhere to this MFA minimalism is just bad writing. And other writers going through MFA programs don't realize this either because MFA programs only teach other MFA books. So the problem then becomes that an entire rich literary tradition has been substituted for one narrow soulless aesthetic. Publishing professionals glorify writing stripped of all embellishment and digression. impressions. But I don't think that's even necessarily their fault. Our society has told us that writing from an NYU MFA grad is the be-all and end-all of great literature. So can you blame a bunch of MFA students who actually prefer AI writing to human writing? The sort of writing they're being taught is soulless robotic writing. No wonder they think ChatGPT writes better than actual humans. New York publishing has lost its soul, but it's not because of profit or the capitalist machine. It is because we as a society have become unmoored from the long-standing tradition of literary study. We like fast-paced gimmicks over slow scenes and introspection. We no longer trust books that require patience. And that is why no one reads contemporary literary fiction, because this sort of fiction is not written for a general audience who actually wants to sit down and think about their lives, because that is the fundamental purpose of literature. This sort of literature is written for an MFA audience where the perception is that if you can use as few words as possible to deliver your message, you have become an accomplished writer. And that's not necessarily true. Every writer before Hemingway will tell you that literature is digressive, that it goes deep into the human soul. And some scenes that might not seem very relevant are actually doing a lot of psychological work, because real literature isn't about tidy sentences. It's about messy phrases that explore the inner depth of the human soul. And contrary to popular belief, the masses actually like books that cause us to think. After all, each of us is on a quest to find meaning in our own lives, and literature is one of the best ways to find that meaning. That is precisely why we need real literature back on our shelves. Literature with messy protagonists, and literature that causes us to think about the human soul, rather than books with sterile sentences that have completely embraced nihilism. The reason that contemporary fiction today feels so lifeless is not because readers no longer want literature. It is because the publishing industry has turned its back to real literature and lost touch with the very facets that make us human. If we want to bring real literature back to our shelves, we need to write books that ask fundamental questions about what makes us human, rather than books that just contain tropes and gimmicks. So if you want to join me in the fight of bringing great literature back to our shelves, don't forget to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, follow me over on Instagram where I talk more about these ideas, and don't forget to check out my Substack, Pens and Poison, where I talk about these topics in depth. And let me know what you guys think about the contemporary publishing industry. Has literature lost its soul? And is there hope of bringing the humanistic tradition back to publishing? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next Pens and Poison video.